welcome back. Today we're going to be assembling the engine block along with the pistons and rods into the crankcase and hooking up the rods. And as we start off here, I want to make sure that I have the proper ring gap on the end of my rings, so I stick one into the block like that and use my calipers. Make sure it's zeroed, and then you can just put a little bit right in there, and I got about 32.5 thousandths. And you need at least 4 thousandths per inch of piston. So I got 6.5 inches. So if it was 4 thousandths, that would be like 28 thousandths. And if you had 5, kind of the max would be 5 thousandths per inch. That would be 32.5. So I'm pretty close to the max there. I think everything should be all right there without having to grind or file into the rings for the ring gap. I think I can just put them right in on the piston, and it should be right. I talked to another fellow that did a lot of work on these old tractors in the day, and he said most of the parts that came from Deere were all ready to assemble. So, but it's nice to fit things in to make sure that they're right when you put them together, because if you don't have enough ring gap, why, your engine will lock up on you once it gets heated up. So we'll go over to the bench and we'll start assembling the piston and rod. Okay, we got the piston here all cleaned up, and it has been marked top on here, so you want to make sure that you got your piston always oriented to the top. And the reason that there is because they got an extra slit along the bottom side for the oil to go through into the oil ring, and there's no slot on the top. So you want to make sure you assemble it correctly. And then the rod, these are new rods. I had to mark them, but this is rod number 1, so I put a 1 on each side of the rod bearing, and that'll be the top of the rod then too. So putting it in this way, so the top of the piston's here, the top of the rod, and then the pin has 2 slotted spots in it for the set screws to set into, and you want to make sure you keep those orientated to the top side of the piston where the set screws are going to mesh. Slip it in there. As I cleaned up everything, I took a small hone and honed out those pin holes so that they would go in there, and so get all the rust out of them, and cleaned up all the ring grooves, and tried to get as much rust off of what I could, though it takes me about 2 days to clean up parts before I can start assembling. Got about the same gap on both sides on that pin. And then the next step is to tighten the lock nut. Kind of angles down in there. And then there's a wire tie that has to go on there. I suppose you can't see that. I'll turn it. There's a hole in the edge of the piston, and then a hole through the head of the set screw. Try to get those as tight as you can without twisting it off, because there's a lot of motion in there that'll loosen up your wires if they're not tight. Okay, and then the rings, I've got those all cleaned up, but back in the day when this was probably an old set of rings from like the 40s, and at that time they didn't have a special oil ring yet that they produced. All the rings were the same, so in this set you don't have to watch out for an oil ring that goes on there. These rings aren't that hard to get on there. Some of them are difficult. Okay, so when I put the rings in, I like to put them staggered. So if this is the first ring, put the gap down at the bottom, and then the next one right at the top, and then I put these two to the side. So the two pairs of rings have opposite gaps in them on the piston on the opposite side. And I don't know if there's any really right way or wrong way to do it, but that's the way I do it. And so I give uh, as much clearance between the gaps and the rings as I can. I'm not sure there's a right or wrong way. And then the top ring, uh, I think I put the open into the bottom. And then I'll reset and go over here to the block. So I'm here to the block. I've already got one piston rod in the block, and the other one we just assembled is right here. I'm going to put a little oil on it, get some oil in those rings so it'll slip together a little easier. Kind of work the oil around the rings. And that one I'm going to leave the gap at the top. This one I'll put to the side, and this one 180 degrees to the other side, and this one to the top on the ring gap, and this one to the bottom on the ring gap. And make sure they all have a little oil in them. And then I have my ring compressor sleeve. Try to pull it up to that first ring so I have a little spot of the piston down at the bottom to stick into the cylinder. And then I want to oil the cylinder a little bit. Turn it around. This is the top of the piston, so make sure you get those in there right. And then just push it down in there. Try to do it straight and all. I think my sleeve is wanting to go down in there. Maybe I'm just a touch tight with that. Something's binding just a little bit. Make sure. I think the bottom of that sleeve is going in the piston right here. This is the problem. There we go. So the bottom edge of that sleeve was getting down in the cylinder and binding up, so you got to watch that. Okay, I think we're ready to put that on the crane and get it pushed up to the crankcase and start installing it. So I've put oil in the crankcase and oiled up the camshaft and the lifters, and I'm seeing if the oil pump will pump oil, which it does, and that the oil is coming through the ports for the rod journals. And all that is occurring, so I'm confident that my oiling system is going to work. And so now it's time to stick the block on with the rods. You want to leave the crank about right there so the rods have room enough to stick in there without interfering with the crank. I've got a gasket on here. I made a gasket. I didn't have that one. Most of the gaskets I'm using are new old stock, but that one I did not have, so I made one, and I've got sealer on it. And then you want to make sure that your rods don't stick through too far into the block, because there's a ridge in there that if you get pushed past there, you can't get your rings back across that, and you'll have to start all over and push the rod out the front and reinsert it from the back end. So now I'll swing the block around and insert it in there. Looks like I'm pretty well lined up, and I'm not pushing anything on the rods right now. Looks like everything's going to clear. I can put my bolts and nuts on there. Okay, I can take the lift off, tighten a couple more here, and then we'll hook up the rods. I think I'll reposition the camera. So I've hooked up the one rod. I'm down to piston number 2, ready to put it together. Got the cap off, and I'm going to put a little oil on that journal. Make sure it's all lubricated good before I put it together. And then swing it up around. And then I've got it marked here with the number 2, and that's number 2 cylinder. Number 1 cylinder is always the left-hand cylinder. And I got my shim packs in there, and the bolts stuck and meshed with the flat part on the shoulder in there, so they're fully out and caught, so they won't turn when you turn on the bolts. The good thing about this is that the machinist fit all the bearings to the crank, so I don't have to fool around with shims. But if you had to do some shim work, well, you'd have to test fit it several different times. It takes a lot of different times. I've done them. And each shim is 3/1000ths. The little thin shims, the brass ones, are 3/1000ths. And there's supposed to be about 5/1000ths clearance in there. So if you get to the point where it'll turn mostly but not clear around, you probably need about one more shim on both sides of the bearing, and then you'll be pretty close to 5/1000ths. But sometimes it's quite a trial to get there, it seems like. And another thing you want to make sure of is when you got the rod stuck in there and you're working on trying to connect one over the other, that you don't push the piston, run your crank around and hit a rod and then push the piston out the front of the block to where your rings go past that ridge on the outside part. If you do that, you pretty much have to start all back over and take the block off and reassemble the piston in from the back side. But make sure your bolts are all meshed with the flat face down there, inserted into the flat part on the rod. One way you can tell is if all your bolts are the same length out here. If you got one that's quite a bit shorter, while you're probably up on the ridge, kind of go around them, kind of snug them all up in a pattern. Instead of doing one all the way in, just kind of work them all up together. And then your keyway is about sideways, so you want to end up so you can get your keyway in. Sometimes it's too loose to one and too tight to the next. So there I've got them about right for the cotter keys, and we'll see if it'll turn over nicely. And another thing is that oil ring on the back comes out halfway inside the block in here. So you want to make sure your block is completely tightened up to the crankcase. Otherwise, if you pull that piston clear back, that top ring might come out, that oil ring might come out, and then you got to figure out how to get that pushed back in there. And it looks like everything is really nice. I guess that's what happens when you start out with everything new. I wish I had a new crank, but you can't have everything, I guess. But that all looks really nice. I'll top off the crankcase with oil up to the top cock down there. It's about in there. Let's see, what else is there you should know? It's pretty simple. The hardest part is to get the shimming all correct. It's nice it was already fitted before everything went together, and all I had to do is assemble it. But I probably have taken those caps off a dozen times sometimes to get the right shimmage in them, so they'll turn freely all the way around with the minimum amount of clearance. As you can see, I got my wires all tied on my transmission. This babbitt in here that's poured into the shaft, I didn't have to fool with that. It was pretty tight. It's probably got a 16th in there. It could be a little bit better, but boy, it's not even worth fooling with, as good as it is. So I'm happy with that. And I suppose the next episode will be installing the head and the push rods. Maybe before I do that, I will put on the reduction cover and slip the belt pulley on and maybe put on the governor. I've got the governor all rebuilt. I did that a year or more ago, so I'll just walk you through that a little bit on everything I put in that, but I won't have any videos of that. But anyway, thanks for watching, and if you like this, why subscribe to my YouTube channel, and we'll see you down the road. So I haven't discussed my parts list for quite a while. What I'm hoping to find yet to put on my project. I've crossed out some of them on top that I'm probably, even if I found them, I probably wouldn't go back and put them back in, like the crankshaft and those big gears in the transmission. But like I could still use the push rods, and if I got a shift lever, I'd probably put that in yet. Take the old one out and put the new one in. The control rods for the clutch and throttle and spark, and the levers and the quadrant for the clutch handle and the short clutch handle, and the oil gauge rod, piston, and cap. Flywheel bolts, air pipe, air stack, the hitch parts, the spring parts, the steering shafts, tie rod, radius rods, front gas tank bracket I wish I could find. I could use a gas tank, and the radiator castings. Some of those things I don't think exist, but some of the parts that I'd really like to find is the parts that go in this oil gauge, the piston and the rod and the cap. Another thing is the push rods. I got one new push rod. That's a D214R. Be nice to find that. But yeah, those are some of the parts I would still be interested in finding that I could still get assembled on my project. So if anybody has those, message me. I'd really appreciate it.